Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're exploring something that's going to make you question everything you think you know about privacy, identity, and what it means to be seen. We're talking about people who dreamed they were completely transparent, not just metaphorically, but literally see through, watching their own organs pump and flow while their most private thoughts became visible streams of light. So before you settle in for the night, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you actually enjoy these weird historical dream stories. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and maybe tell me about the strangest dream you've had recently. It's always fascinating to see how these bizarre experiences connect people across time and space. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, and let your mind wander into tonight's exploration of transparency dreams and the lasting anxiety they created about the nature of privacy and the self. And hey, if you end up falling asleep somewhere in the middle, that's exactly what we're going for here. So picture this, it's 1387 in a remote monastery perched high in the mountains of northern Italy, where the winter winds howl through stone corridors like the voices of forgotten saints. And Brother Augustine, a 34-year-old Benedictine monk who spent his entire adult life hunched over manuscripts with nothing more exciting happening than the occasional ink spill, suddenly starts having dreams that would make a modern person question their sanity and probably book an immediate appointment with a therapist. Now, Augustine wasn't your typical medieval mystic floating around having visions of angels and divine revelations. This guy was practical, methodical, a kind of monk who got genuinely excited about perfectly formed letters and could spot a copying error from across the scriptorium. He'd been living in the monastery of San Salvatore for 12 years without any unusual spiritual experiences, just quiet devotion, daily prayers that followed the same rhythm as the seasons, and endless hours bent over parchment with his quill, creating those beautiful illuminated manuscripts that took months to complete and probably gave him chronic neck pain. Augustine was known among his brothers for his remarkable attention to detail and his ability to catch mistakes that other scribes missed completely. When Brother Francis would accidentally write angels instead of angels, Augustine would spot it immediately and gently correct it with the patience of someone who genuinely loved the work. When the younger monks would get sloppy with their letter spacing or start rushing through their copying assignments, Augustine would sit with them for hours, showing them how to form each letter with the care and precision that sacred texts deserved. But starting on August 10th, the feast of St. Lawrence, which seemed significant to Augustine later, though he could never figure out exactly why, everything in his orderly, predictable world turned completely upside down. Augustine began having the same dream every single night for 3 months. And this wasn't some vague, symbolic vision filled with metaphorical imagery that medieval monks usually described in flowery, mystical language that made perfect sense to them but sounds completely bonkers to modern readers. This was disturbingly specific, anatomically precise, and so vivid that Augustine would wake up each morning feeling like he'd spent the night attending the world's strangest medical school lecture. Except the subject was his own body and the professor was apparently his subconscious mind, operating with knowledge that shouldn't have existed for another few centuries. In his dream, Augustine would wake up in his familiar cell, the same small stone room where he'd slept for over a decade, with its simple wooden cot, small writing desk, and crucifix on the wall that he'd looked at thousands of times. Everything would appear completely normal at first. The pre-dawn light would be filtering through the narrow window exactly as it did every morning, creating those familiar patterns of shadow and illumination that marked the beginning of another day of prayer and manuscript copying. But then Augustine would glance down at his hands, those same hands that had copied thousands of pages of sacred text without ever seeming particularly remarkable, and discover that his skin had become completely transparent, like the finest Venetian glass or clear mountain water. He could see his blood moving through his veins in real time, watching the rhythmic pulse as his heart pumped life throughout his body. He could observe his bones, muscles, and tendons working together with mechanical precision that was both beautiful and terrifying. Augustine could see his heart beating through his chest wall, not just the general motion, but the specific four-chambered structure with its intricate valves opening and closing in perfect synchronization. He could watch his lungs expanding and contracting with each breath. Observe the delicate network of air passages that brought life-giving breath throughout his body. He could see his liver, kidneys, and other organs performing their mysterious functions with a complexity that he had never imagined existed inside the human form. But here's where Augustine's transparency dreams became truly extraordinary and psychologically disturbing. He could also see his thoughts. Augustine described seeing his thoughts as streams of colored light flowing through his transparent brain like luminous rivers following channels that he somehow understood corresponded to different types of mental activity. Different types of thoughts had different colors and textures in Augustine's transparent brain. Prayers appeared as golden threads that seemed to rise upward through his skull toward heaven, moving with a steady, peaceful rhythm that matched his spoken Latin. Doubts about his faith or his vocation showed up as dark purple clouds that swirled and churned in specific areas of his brain, creating turbulence that he could feel as anxiety and uncertainty. What Augustine called impure thoughts, probably concerns about food when he was hungry, or wondering what was happening in the outside world beyond the monastery walls, or occasionally thinking about the life he might have lived if he hadn't become a monk, manifested as red sparks that he desperately tried to hide but couldn't control. These red sparks would dart around his transparent brain like guilty secrets, and Augustine could see them as clearly as if they were written in fire across his forehead. The psychological horror of this transparency was almost unbearable for Augustine. Here was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to achieving spiritual purity and maintaining perfect devotion to God. And suddenly his every mental process was on display like some kind of medieval X-ray machine combined with a divine lie detector test that revealed every moment of doubt, every flicker of worldly desire, every thought that fell short of perfect holiness. Imagine trying to maintain spiritual discipline when you can literally watch your own mind wandering during prayer. See your attention drifting toward thoughts of the delicious bread the kitchen monks baked on Thursdays. Observe your irritation with Brother Marcus, who always snored too loudly during morning prayers. Augustine felt like he was living under constant surveillance by his own consciousness, unable to hide anything from himself or from what he believed was God's all-seeing eye. But Augustine's transparency dreams became even more disturbing when he realized that not only could he see through himself, but other people in the monastery could see through him too. In his dreams, he would try to attend morning prayers in the chapel, but all the other monks would stare at him in fascination and horror, watching his internal organs function and reading his thoughts like scrolling text across his transparent forehead. Augustine would see Brother Francis pointing at his stomach and whispering to Brother Marcus about the bread Augustine had hidden in his cell for late-night snacking when hunger made concentration difficult. He would watch Father Abbot observing the purple clouds of doubt in Augustine's brain and shaking his head sadly at this monk who clearly struggled with faith despite his outward devotion. The most humiliating part of these dreams was when Augustine would try to pray or participate in religious ceremonies while transparent. Every other monk could see exactly how distracted he became, how his mind wandered from sacred Latin to wondering whether the scribal work he'd completed the previous day contained any errors, or whether Brother Thomas had remembered to feed the monastery cats, or whether the winter would be harsh enough to require extra firewood. Augustine felt like his privacy, his inner spiritual life, and his ability to maintain dignity had been completely stripped away. In a world where monks were supposed to be models of devotion and spiritual discipline, Augustine was forced to confront the reality that his inner life was far messier, more complicated and more human than the serene exterior he tried to maintain. But here's the really wild part that makes Augustine's story so fascinating from a historical perspective. Augustine started documenting these dreams with scientific precision that was way ahead of his time, centuries before anyone had developed systematic methods for studying human anatomy or consciousness. Augustine began keeping detailed written records of everything he observed in his transparency dreams, approaching his visions with the same methodical attention to detail that he brought to copying manuscripts. He wrote descriptions of what he saw inside his transparent body, drew detailed anatomical diagrams, and recorded how different activities or emotional states affected his internal processes. When modern medical historians examined Augustine's drawings centuries later, they were astounded to discover that his depictions of human anatomy were remarkably accurate for someone living 200 years before Leonardo da Vinci started doing systematic human dissections. Augustine's diagrams correctly showed the four-chambered structure of the heart, the branching patterns of blood vessels in the lungs, the connection between the nervous system and different organs, and the general layout of internal structures that shouldn't have been known to medieval people. How did a 14th century monk who had never seen inside a human body, who lived in a time when medical knowledge was based on ancient Greek texts rather than actual observation, somehow know that the heart has four chambers? How did he correctly understand that blood circulates throughout the body in a systematic pattern? How did he accurately depict the relationship between breathing and blood oxygenation? Either Augustine was the world's first psychic anatomist, or these transparency dreams were somehow giving him access to knowledge about human physiology that was completely impossible for him to possess through normal means. The accuracy of his anatomical observations suggests that his dreams weren't just products of imagination or religious symbolism, but was somehow providing him with real information about the structure and function of the human body. Augustine's dreams began affecting his waking life in ways that terrified him and made daily monastery routine almost unbearable. He became obsessed with privacy and concealment, wearing extra layers of robes even during hot summer weather, pulling his hood low over his face during communal prayers, and avoiding eye contact with other monks because he was convinced that somehow his mental processes were becoming visible to others even when he was awake. The poor guy developed what we would now recognize as severe social anxiety, but in 1387, they called it spiritual trial and assumed it was either divine testing or demonic temptation. Augustine believed his transparency dreams were either a gift from God meant to deepen his spiritual understanding, or a curse from Satan designed to torment him with self-consciousness and destroy his ability to live peacefully in religious community. Augustine couldn't figure out which explanation was worse. If the dreams were divine revelation, then God was showing him the mésanges and imperfection of his inner life in ways that made spiritual growth feel impossible rather than inspiring. If the dreams were demonic temptation, then Satan had found the perfect torture method, making Augustine so self-conscious about his thoughts and bodily functions that he couldn't focus on prayer or community life. The transparency dreams also affected Augustine's work as a scribe in unexpected ways. When he tried to copy religious texts, he would become distracted by thoughts about whether the original authors had experienced the same kinds of mental wandering and physical awareness that he was discovering in himself. When he worked on manuscripts about saints and their perfect devotion, Augustine found himself wondering whether these holy people had also struggled with transparent self-awareness, or whether his experience was unique and possibly pathological. Augustine started making copying errors for the first time in his career, not because his technical skills had declined, but because he was so distracted by questions about consciousness, privacy, and the relationship between inner experience and outer expression. His transparency dreams had made him intensely curious about things that medieval monasticism generally discouraged: questions about individual psychology, the nature of thought, and the relationship between body and soul. But then Augustine decided to do something that was both brilliant and potentially dangerous in 14th century religious culture. He decided to test whether his dreams might have practical applications beyond just tormenting him with self-consciousness. Augustine started making predictions based on what he observed inside people's transparent bodies in his dreams. When Brother Francis appeared in Augustine's dreams with dark areas around his lungs, Augustine would suggest that Francis rest more and avoid the damp sections of the monastery. When he saw inflammation in Brother Michael's digestive system during dream visions, Augustine would recommend that Michael avoid certain foods and drink herbal teas that might soothe his stomach. Here's the thing that absolutely baffled everyone at the monastery and made Augustine's reputation spread beyond the walls of San Salvatore. His medical predictions based on transparency dreams were uncannily accurate. Brothers would develop exactly the illnesses Augustine had predicted after observing internal problems in their dream bodies. Monks who followed Augustine's dietary or lifestyle recommendations would recover from health problems faster than those who relied solely on conventional medieval medicine. The monastery's physician, Brother Anselm, who had learned medicine from ancient Greek texts and a lifetime of practical experience, started consulting Augustine about diagnoses and treatments. This was revolutionary in medieval medical culture, where healing was based on established authority and traditional remedies rather than individual insight or mystical revelation. Brother Anselm began bringing difficult cases to Augustine, describing symptoms and asking whether Augustine's dreams revealed any insights about internal causes or effective treatments. Augustine would pray for guidance, and often his subsequent dreams would show him the transparent bodies of the sick monks, revealing problems that conventional examination had missed. This collaboration between traditional medieval medicine and Augustine's transparency visions created some of the most effective healthcare available anywhere in 14th century Europe. Monks at San Salvatore had better health outcomes and longer life expectancy than religious communities that relied solely on conventional medical practices. But Augustine's growing reputation as a medical mystic also created problems that he hadn't anticipated. Word of his diagnostic abilities spread to nearby monasteries and eventually reached secular authorities who were always interested in anything that might provide advantages in an era when effective medical care could mean the difference between life and death for important political figures. Augustine found himself receiving requests for medical consultations from nobles, merchants, and church officials who had heard about the monk who could see inside people's bodies through divine revelation. These requests put Augustine in an uncomfortable position. He wanted to use his gift to help people, but he was also deeply private and preferred the quiet routine of monastic life to the attention and political complications that came with being known as a miracle worker. The most challenging aspect of Augustine's situation was his growing understanding that his transparency dreams weren't just showing him anatomy and medical conditions, they were revealing the psychological and spiritual states of the people around him in ways that raised profound questions about privacy, judgment, and human relationships. Augustine began seeing not just physical problems in people's transparent dream bodies, but emotional wounds, spiritual struggles, and moral conflicts that they were trying to keep hidden. He could observe guilt, fear, anger, and longing moving through people's transparent minds like weather patterns, and he could see how these internal states affected their physical health and social relationships. This knowledge was both a blessing and a burden for Augustine. On one hand, it made him incredibly compassionate and understanding. He could see that people's difficult behaviors often stemmed from pain or fear that they couldn't express openly. On the other hand, it made social relationships complicated because Augustine knew things about people that they hadn't chosen to share with him. Dreams don't just show you who you are, sometimes they show you through yourself, revealing the terrifying beauty of human machinery most of us never get to witness. But when transparency becomes permanent, privacy becomes impossible, and intimacy becomes something entirely different. Augustine eventually wrote a detailed account of his experiences in a manuscript he called Corpus Vitrium, the glass body, which became one of the most unusual documents in medieval religious literature. The text was part mystical revelation, part anatomical textbook, part psychological analysis, and part theological meditation on the nature of human consciousness and divine knowledge. Corpus Vitrium described not just what Augustine saw in his transparency dreams, but how the experience of being completely visible to himself and others affected his understanding of privacy, shame, dignity, and human identity. Augustine wrote about the psychological challenge of maintaining spiritual discipline when every thought and bodily function was observable, and about the social difficulty of living in community when personal boundaries have become completely permeable. The manuscript also included Augustine's detailed anatomical drawings and his theories about how the human body functioned as an integrated system of physical, mental, and spiritual processes. His descriptions of circulation, respiration, digestion, and nervous system function were centuries ahead of official medical knowledge and influenced later Renaissance anatomists who rediscovered his work. But perhaps the most profound section of Corpus Victrium dealt with Augustine's reflections on privacy and human dignity in the context of complete transparency. Augustine wrote about feeling like he was living inside a watchtower where all the guards could observe the prisoner's every thought and feeling, and about the psychological impact of being unable to hide any aspect of his inner experience. Augustine's insights about surveillance and privacy anticipated modern concerns about technology and social control by about 600 years. He wrote about the difference between chosen transparency, sharing personal information, voluntarily with trusted people, and imposed transparency where privacy is removed without consent. He argued that human dignity required some measure of inner privacy and that complete visibility could be just as dehumanizing as complete invisibility. Augustine's transparency dreams eventually stopped as suddenly as they had started, after exactly 3 months of nightly visions. He never experienced anything similar again, but the impact of those 3 months affected him for the rest of his life and influenced medieval understanding of consciousness, medical diagnosis, and the relationship between body and soul. After his transparency visions ended, Augustine spent the remaining 30 years of his life developing what he called internal dignity, practices and principles designed to respect and protect people's inner lives even when external circumstances made privacy difficult. He advocated for confession practices that emphasized healing rather than punishment, medical care that treated patients as complete human beings rather than collections of symptoms, and community relationships based on voluntary sharing rather than forced exposure. Augustine's ideas about internal dignity influenced monastic communities throughout medieval Europe and contributed to the development of more humane approaches to healthcare, education, and social relationships. His transparency dreams had given him unique insights into human nature that he used to create more compassionate and effective ways of caring for people's physical, psychological, and spiritual needs. The monastery of San Salvatore preserved Augustine's manuscripts and continued using his diagnostic techniques for centuries after his death. His approach to combining mystical insight with practical medical care became a model for other religious communities and helped establish the tradition of monastery hospitals that provided some of the most advanced healthcare available in medieval Europe. Augustine died peacefully in 1421 at the age of 68, surrounded by monks who credited him with transforming their understanding of human nature and divine compassion. His final words, according to community records, were, "I have seen through the glass darkly, but now I know that transparency is not about seeing everything. It is about understanding how much there is to see." In 1503, there was a young artist named Giovanni Bellicorti working as an apprentice in Leonardo da Vinci's workshop in Milan. And let me tell you, this wasn't exactly the glamorous Renaissance art studio experience you might imagine from Hollywood movies. Giovanni wasn't destined to become famous like his master. History barely remembers his name, which is honestly pretty typical for most apprentices in that era who spent their days grinding pigments, cleaning brushes, and holding candles while more important people did the actual creating. But what happened to Giovanni during a fever in the spring of 1503 resulted in some of the most detailed anatomical drawings of the human circulatory system ever created before the invention of modern medical imaging. And I'm talking about drawings so accurate that they wouldn't look out of place in a contemporary medical textbook, except they were made by a guy who was basically dying of typhoid in a Renaissance art studio. Giovanni had been working for Leonardo for about 3 years, which meant he'd graduated from the absolutely miserable jobs, like mixing plaster and scrubbing paint stains, to the slightly less miserable jobs like organizing Leonardo's chaotic notes and assisting with his anatomical studies. And when I say assisting, I mean standing around holding candles and trying not to vomit while Leonardo dissected corpses that had been obtained from local hospitals and morgues through arrangements that were probably legally questionable but academically invaluable. This was grisly work that most apprentices found absolutely horrifying. We're talking about cutting open human bodies in an era before refrigeration, proper ventilation, or any real understanding of hygiene. The smell alone was apparently so bad that most apprentices would make excuses to avoid anatomy sessions, claiming they needed to work on painting techniques or clean the workshop tools, anything to avoid spending hours in a room with decomposing human remains. But Giovanni was genuinely fascinated by the mechanical complexity of the human body in ways that set him apart from other apprentices, who just wanted to learn how to paint pretty pictures of saints and nobles. While other students were focused on mastering perspective and color mixing, Giovanni was captivated by questions about how hearts beat, how lungs breathe, and how all the different systems inside the human body managed to work together with such incredible precision. Leonardo noticed Giovanni's unusual interest in anatomy and started giving him more responsibilities during dissection sessions. Giovanni would take notes while Leonardo made observations, help position bodies for optimal viewing of specific organs, and ask questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity about physiological processes rather than just artistic technique. Then, in early April 1503, Giovanni caught what was almost certainly typhoid fever, one of those diseases that was incredibly common in Renaissance Italy and killed a huge percentage of people who contracted it, especially in crowded urban areas like Milan, where sanitation was primitive and disease spread rapidly through contaminated water and food. For 6 days, Giovanni lay unconscious in the workshop's back room, a small space that Leonardo had set up as living quarters for his apprentices. Leonardo and the other students expected Giovanni to die. His fever was so high that he was burning up, delirious and completely unresponsive to efforts to wake him or get him to drink water or take any food. Giovanni was muttering constantly during his unconsciousness, but not the usual fevered nonsense that sick people typically babbled. Instead, he was speaking in detailed, technical language about rivers of light and singing blood and the great wheel that turns inside the chest. Leonardo, who was always fascinated by unusual phenomena and recorded everything that caught his attention, started taking notes on Giovanni's fever-induced monologues. But during those 6 days of typhoid-induced unconsciousness, Giovanni was experiencing the most detailed transparency dreams ever recorded in Renaissance Europe. Unlike Brother Augustine's religious visions of spiritual transparency, Giovanni's dreams were purely mechanical and artistic, focused on the human body as an incredibly sophisticated machine that operated according to principles of engineering, hydraulics, and what we would now recognize as physics. In his fevered state, Giovanni dreamed that his entire body had become transparent like the finest blown glass that Venetian artisans were just beginning to perfect. But instead of seeing his body as a religious or spiritual revelation, Giovanni experienced his transparency as an artistic and scientific opportunity. He could observe his circulatory system functioning like the most complex hydraulic machine ever designed. What made Giovanni's transparency dreams completely unique was their focus on blood flow and circulation with a level of detail and accuracy that wouldn't be officially recognized by European medicine for another 130 years. Giovanni could see his heart not just as a simple organ that beat rhythmically, but as a sophisticated pump with 4 distinct chambers, precisely timed valves, and coordinated contractions that moved blood throughout his entire body in a systematic, organized pattern. In his dreams, Giovanni watched blood flowing away from his heart through what he described as red rivers, arteries that carried bright, energetic blood to every part of his body. He could see this arterial blood bringing nourishment and life to his muscles, organs, and brain, and he could observe how different activities affected the speed and intensity of blood flow to different areas. But here's what absolutely blew my mind when I first read about Giovanni's case. He also saw blood returning to his heart through what he called blue rivers, veins that carried depleted blood back for renewal and recirculation. Giovanni was essentially dreaming about a complete, closed-loop circulatory system where blood continuously flowed away from the heart through arteries and returned through veins in an endless cycle. This was 130 years before William Harvey officially discovered and described circulation in 1628, completely revolutionizing European medical understanding and overturning centuries of incorrect theories about how blood moved through the human body. Giovanni was dreaming about medical knowledge that was so far ahead of his time that if he had tried to publish his observations, medical authorities would have dismissed them as fantasy or heresy. In Giovanni's transparency dreams, he could also see what he called the body's conversation with itself. Chemical and nervous system communications that appeared as streams of colored light carrying messages between different organs and systems. He observed his liver processing toxins from his fever, appearing as dark substances being filtered and neutralized by what looked like an incredibly complex chemical laboratory. Giovanni could see his kidneys working as sophisticated filtering systems, removing waste products from his blood and maintaining the precise chemical balance necessary for life. He watched his brain coordinating the entire circulatory system through networks of golden light that we would now recognize as neural pathways, carrying signals between the nervous system and cardiovascular controls. The level of physiological accuracy in Giovanni's fever dreams was extraordinary. He correctly observed that his heart rate increased during periods of stress or physical activity, and he could see how this increased pumping action delivered more oxygen and nutrients to muscles and organs that needed additional energy. He watched his blood vessels expanding and contracting to regulate blood pressure and direct circulation to areas where it was most needed. Giovanni also correctly observed the relationship between breathing and circulation. In his transparency dreams, he could see how his lungs oxygenated his blood, turning it from dark blue to bright red, and how this oxygenated blood was then pumped throughout his body to sustain all his organs and tissues. This understanding of the connection between respiratory and circulatory systems was decades ahead of official medical knowledge. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Giovanni's transparency dreams was his perception of circulation as having musical and artistic qualities. Giovanni described seeing his blood flow as resembling musical notation, with rhythmic patterns that corresponded to his heartbeat and flowing melodies that represented the movement of blood through different parts of his circulatory system. In his dreams, Giovanni could hear his circulation as a complex symphony where different instruments represented different aspects of his cardiovascular system. His heartbeat was like percussion providing the basic rhythm. His arterial blood flow was like wind instruments carrying melodic lines throughout his body, and his venous return was like string instruments creating harmonious undertones that completed the circulatory symphony. This musical perception of circulation influenced Giovanni's later artistic style in profound ways and suggested that his transparency dreams were connecting physiological processes with aesthetic experiences in ways that were completely unprecedented in Renaissance art and science. When Giovanni finally woke up after 6 days of unconsciousness, the first thing he did before asking for water, food, or information about what had happened to him was start drawing everything he had seen in his transparency dreams. Working with a precision and accuracy that amazed even Leonardo, who was already one of the most skilled anatomical artists in Europe, Giovanni created detailed illustrations showing blood flow patterns, cardiac anatomy, and circulatory system relationships that were centuries ahead of contemporary medical knowledge. Giovanni's drawings showed the heart as a four-chambered pump with accurately depicted valves that prevented backflow and ensured unidirectional circulation. He illustrated the branching patterns of arteries as they carried blood away from the heart, and the converging patterns of veins as they returned blood for recirculation. His diagrams showed correct proportions, anatomical relationships, and functional details that shouldn't have been possible for someone with no formal medical training. Leonardo was absolutely fascinated by his apprentice's fever visions and immediately recognized that Giovanni had somehow gained access to anatomical knowledge that was far beyond anything available in contemporary medical texts. Leonardo had been conducting his own anatomical studies for years, but Giovanni's drawings revealed circulatory system details that Leonardo had never observed in his dissections. Being Leonardo, he was intensely curious about how Giovanni had acquired such accurate anatomical knowledge during his illness. Leonardo interviewed Giovanni extensively about his transparency dreams, taking detailed notes about the visions and comparing Giovanni's descriptions with his own anatomical observations. Leonardo realized that Giovanni's fever had somehow given him access to physiological insights that were completely impossible through normal means. Leonardo was so impressed by Giovanni's anatomical revelations that he incorporated many of Giovanni's drawings into his own scientific notebooks. Some of the circulation diagrams in Leonardo's famous anatomical studies were actually based on his apprentice's transparency dreams. Though being Leonardo and having the ego of a Renaissance genius, he probably never gave Giovanni full public credit for these insights. But Giovanni's transparency dreams affected much more than just his anatomical knowledge. The experience of seeing his body as a transparent, functioning system changed his entire approach to art and his understanding of human nature. After his fever recovery, all of Giovanni's paintings had an almost X-ray quality that viewers found both fascinating and slightly unsettling. Even when Giovanni painted fully clothed portraits of wealthy Milanese nobles and merchants, his subjects seemed to glow from within, as if he was somehow painting their internal vitality and life force rather than just their external appearance. People who saw Giovanni's portraits often commented that the paintings seemed to show not just how subjects looked, but how they felt physically and emotionally, as if Giovanni could see their health, energy levels, and psychological states through their skin. When you've seen the river of life flowing beneath the skin, it becomes impossible to paint people as solid, opaque objects. Every body becomes a window, every face becomes a doorway to infinite internal complexity, and every portrait becomes a meditation on the mysterious machinery of human existence. Giovanni's transparency dreams had also given him an almost supernatural ability to diagnose health problems in his portrait subjects, which created both opportunities and complications for his artistic career. Wealthy families would commission Giovanni to paint their children not just for artistic purposes, but because his portraits often revealed health issues before they became apparent to conventional physicians. Count Alessandro Visconti commissioned Giovanni to paint his apparently healthy 16-year-old son Marco, expecting a typical Renaissance portrait that would demonstrate the family's wealth and social status. When Giovanni delivered the painting 3 months later, Count Alessandro was initially furious because he claimed the portrait made his son look sickly and wrong inside, as if something dark was growing in his chest. The Count accused Giovanni of deliberately painting his son to appear unhealthy, perhaps as some kind of artistic commentary on the Visconti family or Renaissance social conditions. The Count refused to pay for the portrait and threatened to damage Giovanni's reputation by telling other noble families that he created unflattering paintings that made healthy people appear diseased. But 3 months after Giovanni completed the portrait, Marco developed the exact symptoms of consumption, tuberculosis, that Giovanni had somehow seen and painted into the portrait before they manifested physically. Marco began coughing blood, losing weight rapidly, and experiencing the chest pain and breathing difficulties that Giovanni's portrait had mysteriously anticipated. When Marco's illness became obvious, Count Alessandro returned to Giovanni's studio, not to apologize for his earlier anger, but to ask how Giovanni had known about his son's condition before any symptoms were visible. The Count wanted to know whether Giovanni's diagnostic abilities could be used to assess other family members and whether his transparency visions could predict the progression of Marco's disease. This diagnostic ability made Giovanni both famous and feared throughout Milan's artistic and social communities. Noble families wanted his portraits because of their uncanny medical accuracy, but they also worried about what internal problems Giovanni might reveal that they preferred to keep hidden. People started approaching Giovanni's paintings with the same mixture of fascination and anxiety that they felt toward oracles and fortune tellers. Giovanni found himself in the uncomfortable position of being sought after not primarily for his artistic skills, but for his ability to see medical problems that conventional examination missed. Physicians started consulting him about difficult cases. Wealthy families wanted him to assess their children's health through portrait sessions, and religious authorities questioned whether his diagnostic abilities were divine gifts or something more questionable. The psychological pressure of this reputation eventually became unbearable for Giovanni. He began refusing portrait commissions because he said it was too psychologically disturbing to see people's future illnesses while trying to capture their present beauty and vitality. Giovanni described feeling like he was always painting people's deaths rather than their lives, seeing the diseases and health problems that would eventually kill them rather than the beauty and personality that defined their current existence. This conflict between artistic beauty and medical foresight created a profound philosophical crisis for Giovanni. He had become fascinated by human anatomy and physiology through his transparency dreams, but he had also discovered that too much knowledge about the body's vulnerabilities could make it impossible to appreciate the mystery and wonder of human life. Giovanni's transparency dreams had also affected his understanding of mortality and time in ways that influenced his entire worldview. After seeing his own body as a temporary, mechanical system, observing his heart beating, his lungs breathing, his blood flowing through vessels that could fail at any moment, he became intensely aware of the fragility and impermanence of human existence. Giovanni wrote in his journal, "To see yourself as transparent is to understand that the body is not a solid house, but a river that temporarily holds its shape. We are not permanent beings, but flowing processes, more like music than stone, more like dance than sculpture." This knowledge is both beautiful and terrible because it shows us how miraculous life is and how easily it can stop. This philosophical perspective influenced Giovanni's later artistic work in profound ways. Instead of painting static portraits that tried to capture permanent beauty, Giovanni began creating paintings that emphasized movement, flow, and the dynamic processes of life. His later work showed people in motion, with flowing clothes and hair that suggested the constant movement of life force through living bodies. Giovanni's approach to art began influencing other artists in Leonardo's workshop and throughout Milan's artistic community. His emphasis on depicting life as process rather than static form contributed to the development of more dynamic and psychologically complex Renaissance painting techniques. But Giovanni's story also illustrates the personal costs of extraordinary perception. The more clearly he could see the internal workings of human bodies, the more isolated he became from normal social relationships. People were either fascinated by his abilities in ways that made him feel like a curiosity rather than a person, or they were frightened by his knowledge in ways that made genuine friendship impossible. Giovanni's transparency dreams had given him unprecedented insights into human physiology, but they had also burdened him with awareness of mortality and suffering. That made it difficult to enjoy the simple pleasures of daily life. He could never look at people without seeing their potential health problems, never appreciate physical beauty without being aware of its temporary nature, never form relationships without being conscious of how illness and death would eventually separate everyone he cared about. Giovanni died young, at age 28, of what was probably a recurrence of the same typhoid fever that had given him his transparency visions. But in his final illness, Giovanni reported that he welcomed death because his dreams had taught him that the boundaries between internal and external, visible and invisible, temporary and eternal, were much less solid than most people believed. In his final journal entry, written just days before his death, Giovanni reflected on the relationship between transparency and artistic truth. "I have learned that the greatest art comes not from hiding the machinery of life, but from revealing its beauty. The heart that beats, the blood that flows, the breath that moves, these are more beautiful than any external decoration." To paint truly is to paint transparently, showing not just how people look, but how wonderfully and mysteriously they are alive. Giovanni's anatomical drawings and artistic innovations influenced Renaissance art and science in ways that extended far beyond his short life. His circulation diagrams were studied by later anatomists who were amazed by their accuracy, and his artistic techniques influenced the development of more psychologically complex portrait painting throughout northern Italy. In 1742, Lady Catherine Worthington was one of the most fashionable women in London society. And when I say fashionable, I mean she was operating at the absolute pinnacle of Georgian social life, hosting elaborate dinner parties that could make or break political careers, attending every important social event from royal court presentations to theater premieres, and wielding the kind of social influence that modern people can barely comprehend because we live in a world where celebrity is often empty and temporary, whereas Catherine's reputation was built on genuine wit, intelligence, and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the incredibly complex social hierarchies of 18th century English aristocracy. Catherine was known throughout London for her beauty, which was the classical Georgian ideal, pale skin that indicated she never had to work outdoors. Elaborately styled hair that required hours of preparation by skilled servants, and the kind of elegant bearing that came from a lifetime of training in how to walk, talk, and behave like someone born to rule. But more than her physical appearance, Catherine was famous for her wit and her ability to make even the stuffiest aristocrats laugh at her clever observations about Georgian social life, politics, and human nature. She could deliver cutting social commentary wrapped in such charming language that people would be laughing at her jokes before they realized she was actually making profound points about the absurdities and contradictions of their world. Catherine had perfected the art of saying exactly what everyone was thinking but nobody dared to express. And she did it with such grace and humor that even people who were the targets of her wit would find themselves appreciating her cleverness. But Lady Catherine was also hiding a secret that would have absolutely scandalized London society if anyone had known about it. She'd been having recurring transparency dreams since childhood, and these dreams had given her an almost psychic ability to read people's true motivations, hidden emotions, and secret desires in ways that made her the most effective social manipulator in Georgian England. Catherine's transparency dreams were completely different from the religious visions of Brother Augustine or the medical revelations of Giovanni Bellacorti. In her dreams, Catherine could see through not just her own body, but through other people's bodies and minds, observing the hidden psychological and emotional machinery that drove social behavior in ways that were both fascinating and sometimes disturbing. Catherine would attend dream versions of real social events, elaborate balls at noble estates, intimate dinner parties in fashionable townhouses, theater performances where the audience was often more entertaining than what was happening on stage. And in these dreams, everyone appeared transparent, revealing their true thoughts and feelings beneath the elaborate facades of polite social behavior. In these transparency dreams, Catherine could see lies as dark clouds swirling around people's hearts, making it impossible for them to deceive her about their real intentions or feelings. She could observe romantic attractions as streams of colored light flowing between individuals, allowing her to see who was falling in love with whom long before the people themselves were consciously aware of their feelings. Catherine could watch social ambitions appear as intricate mechanical systems inside people's transparent heads, complex arrangements of gears, wheels, and pulleys that showed exactly how different people were trying to manipulate social situations to advance their careers, increase their wealth, or improve their social status. She could literally see the calculations and strategizing that people were doing beneath their polite conversational facades. But perhaps most remarkably, Catherine could observe people's deeper emotional states, depression, loneliness, fear, guilt, and joy, as they moved through their transparent bodies like weather systems, affecting their physical health, their decision-making, and their relationships in ways that the people themselves often didn't understand. Now, you have to understand that 18th century English society was built on incredibly elaborate systems of social pretense that made modern social media look simple and straightforward by comparison. People spent enormous amounts of energy maintaining appearances, hiding their true feelings, and navigating complex webs of social obligation, political maneuvering, and economic necessity that required constant performance and strategic thinking. Georgian aristocrats lived in a world where showing genuine emotion could be seen as weakness, where admitting financial problems could destroy social standing, where expressing unpopular political opinions could end careers, and where revealing personal struggles could make someone a target for social predators who were always looking for weaknesses to exploit. Catherine's transparency dreams essentially gave her a comprehensive cheat sheet for this incredibly complex social game. She could see everyone's cards while they thought they were playing with hidden hands. She knew who was secretly in debt, who was having extramarital affairs, who was struggling with depression behind cheerful public personas, and who was plotting against whom in the endless political and social competitions that define Georgian aristocratic life. Catherine began using insights from her transparency dreams to become the most successful social orchestrator in London. She would know in advance which marriages were going to fail, because she could see the contempt and resentment building between spouses who maintained perfect public courtesy. She could predict which business partnerships would prosper because she observed genuine mutual respect and shared values, and which ones would collapse because they were built on deception and exploitation. Catherine could identify political alliances that were based on genuine shared principles versus those that were just temporary conveniences, allowing her to position herself advantageously in the constantly shifting landscape of Georgian politics. She knew which social trends would last and which ones were just momentary fashions, which artists and writers had genuine talent versus those who were just skilled self-promoters, and which social causes were driven by sincere conviction versus those that were just performative virtue signaling. But here's where Catherine's story becomes really fascinating and morally complex. Instead of using her transparency dreams purely for personal advantage or social manipulation, Catherine decided to conduct what she called an experiment in social honesty. That would challenge the fundamental assumptions about privacy, authenticity, and human connection that define Georgian society. Catherine started hosting dinner parties with a twist that was so subtle most guests never consciously realized what was happening, but so effective that her gatherings became legendary throughout London's social elite. She would invite guests based on what she had observed in her transparency dreams, people who were hiding the same types of secrets, struggling with similar problems, or who would benefit from knowing each other's true situations rather than just their public personas. For example, if Catherine's dreams revealed that Lord Pemberton was secretly struggling with massive debts while maintaining an appearance of wealth and success, and she also knew that Mr. Hartwell was looking for investment opportunities but was frustrated by the difficulty of finding trustworthy partners, Catherine would seat them next to each other at dinner and steer the conversation toward topics that would allow them to help each other without losing face or admitting their problems directly. Catherine became a master at creating conversational scenarios that encouraged people to share genuine concerns and authentic experiences rather than just exchanging the usual social pleasantries. She would ask questions that seemed casual but were actually designed to help people discover common ground, shared interests, and complementary needs that could lead to meaningful relationships rather than just superficial social connections. If Catherine's transparency dreams showed her that Lady Morrison was desperately lonely despite her busy social calendar, and that Mrs. Blackwood was struggling with similar isolation behind her reputation as a successful hostess, Catherine would create opportunities for them to meet in contexts where their genuine personalities could emerge rather than just their social roles. Catherine called these gatherings her glasshouse dinners because she said they were designed to create spaces where people could be as transparent and authentic as they appeared in her dreams. The dinners became absolutely legendary in London society, not because people understood what Catherine was doing, but because guests consistently left feeling more connected, understood, and genuinely seen than they had experienced at any other social event. Sometimes transparency isn't about seeing through skin and bone, it's about seeing through the elaborate costumes we wear to hide from each other in the theater of society. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is creating a space where they can safely remove their mask. Word spread throughout Georgian London that Lady Catherine had an almost supernatural ability to bring together people who needed to meet each other. Matches made at her dinner parties resulted in unusually happy marriages that were based on genuine compatibility and mutual understanding rather than just social convenience or financial advantage. Business partnerships formed at Catherine's table tended to be profitable and long-lasting because they were built on real trust and shared values, rather than just temporary mutual benefit. People who met through Catherine often became lifelong friends with deep, authentic connections that transcended the usual superficial relationships that characterized most of Georgian social life. Catherine's dinner parties became a model for more meaningful social interaction that influenced London society in ways that extended far beyond her own social circle. But Catherine's social experiment in transparency had an unexpected and increasingly painful personal cost that she hadn't anticipated when she began using her dreams to help others connect authentically. The more successfully she used her transparency visions to facilitate genuine relationships between other people, the more isolated and lonely she became in her own social and personal life. Catherine could see everyone else's true feelings, motivations, and needs with perfect clarity, but she could never be sure whether people liked her for herself or because of the social opportunities she provided, the useful connections she facilitated, or the mysteriously accurate insights she seemed to possess about human nature and social dynamics. When people praised Catherine's wisdom, wit, or social skills, she wondered whether they were responding to her authentic personality or just to the advantages that came from being associated with someone who seemed to understand social situations with supernatural clarity. When men expressed romantic interest in Catherine, she questioned whether they were attracted to her as a person or just to her social influence and the access she could provide to London's most exclusive circles. Catherine wrote extensively in her private journals about what she called the terrible loneliness of the all-seeing. She described feeling like she was living behind a one-way mirror, able to observe everyone else's true selves while remaining fundamentally unknowable to other people. Her transparency dreams had made her the perfect social facilitator and relationship counselor, but they had also made genuine personal intimacy nearly impossible. The psychological burden of knowing everyone's secrets while being unable to share her own became almost unbearable for Catherine. She knew which of her friends were struggling with depression, financial problems, marital difficulties, and health issues, but she couldn't offer direct help without revealing that she possessed impossible knowledge about their private lives. Catherine also struggled with the moral implications of her transparency dreams. Was it ethical to use her knowledge of people's hidden motivations and secret needs to manipulate social situations, even if her intentions were helpful? Did people have a right to privacy that she was violating by seeing through their carefully constructed public personas? Was she helping people connect authentically, or was she just a more sophisticated type of social manipulator? The most tragic aspect of Catherine's situation was how her transparency dreams eventually made her question the nature of authentic human connection itself. If she could only understand people by seeing through them, were her relationships based on genuine affection and mutual understanding, or just on superior information and strategic advantage? Catherine began to wonder whether true intimacy required the possibility of privacy, mystery and gradual revelation that allowed relationships to develop naturally over time. If she could see everything about people immediately, was she missing the joy and depth that came from slowly discovering someone's character, preferences, fears, and dreams through shared experiences and voluntary disclosure? The more Catherine used her transparency dreams to help others remove their social masks and connect authentically, the more she realized that she had never learned how to be genuinely vulnerable herself. She had become so skilled at seeing through other people that she had forgotten how to be genuinely seen by others, so effective at facilitating intimacy that she had lost the ability to experience it personally. Catherine's final journal entry, written shortly before her death in 1798 at the age of 82, included this haunting reflection that captures the fundamental paradox of her transparent existence. I have spent my life helping others remove their masks and discover their authentic selves, but I have never learned how to remove my own mask or allow others to see my authentic self. Perhaps the curse of transparency is not that others can see through you, but that you become so skilled at seeing through others that you forget how to be genuinely seen yourself. I have observed that people treasure most the relationships where they can be known gradually, where they can choose what to reveal and when, where intimacy develops through mutual vulnerability rather than one-sided exposure. But I have never experienced that kind of relationship because I always know too much too quickly, and I can never be sure whether people's responses to me are genuine or just reactions to the social advantages I provide. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of perfect vision is that it blinds you to the beauty of mystery, and the deepest loneliness comes not from being unknown, but from being unable to experience the joy of being slowly, carefully, lovingly discovered by another human being. Despite her personal isolation, Catherine's influence on Georgian society was profound and lasting. The Glasshouse Society, as historians later called her experimental approach to social interaction, helped establish new models of authentic conversation and genuine connection that valued honesty over pretense, mutual understanding over social manipulation, and emotional intelligence over mere wit and cleverness. Many of the social reforms of the late 18th century, improvements in treatment of mental illness, more compassionate approaches to poverty and social problems, and the development of more egalitarian relationship models, can be traced back to ideas and relationships that developed at Catherine's dinner table. Catherine's approach to combining transparency with compassion influenced early feminist thinking, progressive political movements, and social reform efforts throughout Britain and eventually Europe. Her emphasis on seeing people's full humanity rather than just their social roles contributed to broader, cultural changes that challenged rigid class hierarchies and social conventions. The techniques Catherine developed for creating authentic, social connections were studied and adapted by later social reformers, educators, and even early psychologists who were interested in understanding human behavior and improving social relationships. Her insights about the relationship between privacy, vulnerability, and genuine intimacy influenced the development of more sophisticated approaches to counseling, education, and community building. Lady Catherine Worthington's transparency dreams had given her unprecedented insight into human nature and social dynamics, but they had also taught her that the most profound human connections require not just the ability to see through others, but the courage to be seen through yourself, something that perfect vision paradoxically made impossible for her to experience. Josiah Blockwell owned one of the largest textile mills in New Hampshire in the 1850s. And when I say large, I'm talking about a massive industrial operation that employed over 400 workers and produced thousands of yards of cloth every week for markets stretching from Boston to Charleston. This wasn't some quaint artisanal workshop. This was serious industrial capitalism in action, with enormous steam-powered machines that shook the ground for miles around, work schedules that started before dawn and ended after sunset, and the kind of relentless production demands that turned human beings into components of a vast mechanical system designed to maximize profit and minimize costs. Josiah was known throughout New England's industrial community as a fair but demanding employer, who treated his workers better than most factory owners of his era, which honestly wasn't saying much considering that 1850s industrial labor conditions were often barely distinguishable from slavery. But compared to his contemporaries, Josiah provided decent wages that allowed families to actually survive rather than just barely scrape by. Reasonable working hours that didn't completely destroy people's health within a few years, and safety precautions that were genuinely unusual for the time period. Most factory owners in mid-19th century, America operated according to what we might call the human machinery philosophy. Workers were interchangeable parts in an industrial system, and their individual health, happiness, or personal circumstances were irrelevant as long as production. Quotas were met and profits continued flowing to investors and owners. Worker injuries were considered normal business expenses, employee turnover was just part of operational planning, and the idea that employers had any responsibility for their workers. Welfare beyond paying agreed-upon wages was considered radical and potentially dangerous to the entire economic system. But what Josiah's workers didn't know, and what would have seemed absolutely impossible to his business competitors if they had discovered it, was that Josiah's unusually enlightened management style was based on transparency dreams that showed him the hidden, psychological and physical costs of industrial labor with documentary precision and moral clarity that completely transformed his understanding of business, profit, and human relationships. Starting in the summer of 1854, Josiah began having recurring dreams, where he could see through the bodies of his factory workers as they operated the massive textile machinery that dominated his mill buildings. In these dreams, the workers appeared completely transparent, and Josiah could observe the physical and emotional toll that factory work was taking on their bodies, minds, and spirits in ways that were both scientifically accurate and morally devastating. Josiah could see the fine cotton dust that filled the air of his textile mill accumulating in workers' lungs like microscopic snow, building up day after day, week after week, until their breathing passages became clogged with fibers that would eventually cause the respiratory diseases that killed so many textile workers in their 40s and 50s. He could watch their hearing being gradually damaged by the constant noise of machinery, The thunderous rhythms of steam engines, the clacking of looms, the grinding of gears, until many workers became partially deaf before they reached middle age. In his transparency dreams, Josiah observed the muscle strain and joint damage caused by repetitive motions that workers perform thousands of times. Every day, the precise hand movements required to operate looms, the constant bending and lifting involved in moving materials, the standing for 12 or 14 hours without adequate rest breaks. He could see inflammation building in workers' joints, muscles becoming chronically tight and painful, and spines developing the curved postures that would cause lifelong back problems. But perhaps most disturbing to Josiah were the psychological effects he could observe inside the workers' transparent heads. The gradual deadening of creativity and curiosity that came from performing the same mechanical tasks hour after hour, the accumulation of resentment and frustration that workers had to suppress in order to keep their jobs, and the slow erosion of personal dignity that resulted from being treated like human machines rather than complete individuals with thoughts, feelings, and potential beyond their industrial function. Josiah could see dreams and aspirations withering inside workers' minds as the demands of factory labor consumed all their time and energy. He observed intelligent, creative people becoming dulled and listless as years of repetitive work destroyed their ability to think independently or imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. He watched family relationships deteriorating as exhausted workers came home too tired to engage meaningfully with their spouses and children. In his transparency dreams, Josiah could also see the hidden connections between working conditions and productivity that most business owners never understood because they focused on short-term profits rather than long-term sustainability and human welfare. He observed how poor lighting affected workers' vision and concentration, leading to mistakes, injuries, and defective products that cost more than the expense of providing adequate illumination. Josiah watched how adequate ventilation influenced workers' energy levels, causing fatigue and illness that reduced productivity and increased absenteeism. He could see how the social dynamics between workers, the cooperation, conflict, mutual support, and competition affected the overall functioning of his industrial operation in ways that were completely invisible to conventional business analysis. Most remarkably, Josiah's transparency dreams showed him how treating workers poorly created inefficiencies and problems that rippled throughout his entire production system. When workers felt disrespected, undervalued, or exploited, Josiah could see their resentment manifesting as subtle sabotage, deliberate slowdowns, and reduced attention to quality that ultimately cost far more than the expenses associated with treating them well. Conversely, when workers felt respected, fairly compensated, and valued as complete human beings rather than just production units, Josiah observed increased creativity, better problem solving, improved cooperation, and genuine care for the quality of their work that enhanced both productivity and profitability in ways that purely mechanical approaches to management could never achieve. What made Josiah's transparency dreams completely unique in the history of industrial management was their focus on systems and relationships rather than just individual performance metrics. Josiah could see how his factory functioned as a complex organism where workers, machines, and processes were interconnected in ways that most business owners never recognized, because they thought about industrial operations in purely mechanical terms. Josiah observed how improving conditions for one group of workers affected the morale and productivity of other departments, how investing in safety equipment reduced not just injury costs, but also the anxiety and stress that made all workers less effective, and how providing opportunities for skill development and advancement created loyalty and expertise that benefited the entire operation. Based on insights from his transparency dreams, Josiah started implementing changes that were decades ahead of standard industrial management practices. He installed better ventilation systems after seeing lung damage accumulating in his dream workers' transparent bodies. He adjusted work schedules and break times after observing fatigue patterns that showed when productivity naturally declined and when workers needed rest to maintain effectiveness. Josiah redesigned workflow patterns after watching how different arrangements affected workers' stress levels, physical strain, and social interactions. He provided safety equipment and training after seeing the specific ways that workers were being injured, and how those injuries could be prevented through relatively simple precautions. But the most revolutionary change Josiah made was introducing what he called transparent management, running his business as if all the hidden costs and benefits of different policies were visible to everyone involved, creating a level of openness and shared decision-making that was almost unprecedented in 1850s American industry. Josiah started holding weekly meetings where he shared detailed information about the company's finances, production costs, profit margins, and business challenges with his workers. He explained how their individual contributions affected overall business success, how business decisions would impact their working conditions and job security, and how they could participate in solving problems and improving operations rather than just following orders without understanding. This level of transparency between management and labor was absolutely revolutionary in mid-19th century America, where most employers operated according to strict, hierarchical principles that kept workers ignorant of business operations and excluded them from any decision-making processes. The idea that ordinary factory workers should understand company finances or have input into business strategy was considered dangerous and potentially subversive to the entire capitalist system. When you can see the true cost of every business decision written in workers' transparent bodies, profit margins become moral calculations, not just mathematical ones. And when people understand how their individual efforts contribute to shared success, they transform from reluctant employees into invested partners. The results of Josiah's transparency-based management approach were absolutely remarkable and attracted attention throughout New England's industrial community. Worker productivity at Blackwell Mills increased dramatically because people understood how their individual efforts contributed to shared success rather than just feeling like replaceable cogs in an impersonal machine. Workplace accidents decreased significantly because everyone was educated about hidden dangers and safety measures, and because workers felt comfortable reporting potential problems without fear of being blamed or punished for raising concerns. Employee turnover dropped to nearly zero because workers felt respected, valued, and invested in the company's success rather than just looking for better opportunities elsewhere. The quality of products manufactured at Blackwell Mills became known throughout the region as superior to textiles produced by other companies, not because Josiah had better machinery or materials, but because his workers took genuine pride in their craftsmanship and paid attention to details that purely profit-driven operations ignored. Word of Josiah's unusual management philosophy spread rapidly throughout New England's manufacturing sector. Other factory owners came to observe his operations, trying to understand how he achieved such high productivity and worker satisfaction while maintaining competitive prices and healthy profit margins. Most visitors focused on the visible policies that made Blackwell Mills different, the safety measures, the profit-sharing arrangements, the open communication between management and workers, the comfortable break areas and decent cafeteria facilities. But they missed the deeper insight that drove Josiah's approach, his transparency dream-based, understanding that every business decision had hidden human consequences that needed to be considered and addressed if the business was going to be truly successful in the long term. Many factory owners tried to copy specific policies from Blackwell Mills without understanding the philosophical foundation that made those policies effective. They would install better ventilation or provide safety equipment, but they would implement these changes in ways that felt paternalistic and controlling rather than respectful and collaborative. They would share some financial information with workers, but they would do it in ways that felt manipulative rather than genuinely transparent. These surface-level imitations usually failed because they didn't address the fundamental issue that Josiah's transparency dreams had revealed, that industrial success required treating workers as complete human beings with intelligence, creativity, and dignity rather than as disposable components of a mechanical system. Josiah's transparency dreams also affected his personal life in ways that were both enriching and psychologically challenging. After seeing the hidden emotional and physical costs of his business decisions in his workers' transparent bodies, he became intensely aware of the invisible effects of all his choices on the people around him, his family, his community, and everyone who was touched by his decisions and actions. This heightened awareness made Josiah a more thoughtful husband and father, but it also created enormous psychological pressure as he felt responsible for consequences that most people never even considered. Josiah started paying attention to how his words and tone of voice affected his wife's emotional state, how his parenting decisions influenced his children's development and self-confidence, and how his role in the community affected social dynamics and local economic conditions. Josiah described feeling like he was carrying the weight of every consequence and worrying constantly about unintended effects of even his most well-intentioned actions. The transparency that had made him a more effective and ethical business owner had also made him hyper-aware of his impact on others in ways that were sometimes overwhelming. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Josiah's story is how his individual transparency dreams influenced broader social and economic changes that extended far beyond his own business operation. Several of his former workers eventually started their own businesses using management principles they had learned at Blackwell Mills, spreading Josiah's approach to other industries and regions. The idea of transparent communication between employers and employees gradually spread throughout New Hampshire's manufacturing sector and eventually influenced labor relations across New England. Trade unions began demanding the kind of openness and shared decision-making that workers at Blackwell Mills had experienced, and some progressive employers adopted similar approaches to avoid labor conflicts and attract skilled workers. Josiah's management philosophy also attracted the attention of early labor organizers, social reformers, and progressive politicians who saw Blackwell Mills as proof that industrial capitalism could operate according to principles of mutual respect and shared benefit rather than exploitation and class conflict. Some historians argue that the management philosophies Josiah developed based on his transparency dreams helped lay the groundwork for progressive labor policies that wouldn't become widespread until the early 20th century. Concepts like worker participation in management decisions, profit-sharing arrangements, workplace safety regulations, and the idea that employers had moral responsibilities to their employees beyond just paying agreed-upon wages. The success of Blackwell Mills also influenced economic thinking about the relationship between worker welfare and business profitability. Josiah's operation demonstrated that treating workers well wasn't just ethically right, it was also economically smart, leading to higher productivity, better quality products, lower turnover costs, and more sustainable long-term growth. When Josiah died in 1889 at the age of 76, his funeral was attended by hundreds of current and former workers, business associates, and community members who credited him with proving that industrial success could be achieved through cooperation and mutual respect rather than exploitation and conflict. Many attendees described working at Blackwell Mills as the only job that ever felt like genuine partnership and the place where I learned that work could be dignified and meaningful rather than just survival. Former workers talked about how their experience at Blackwell Mills had changed their expectations for employment and their understanding of their own worth and potential. The mill continued operating according to Josiah's transparency-based principles until it finally closed during the Great Depression, and many former employees went on to establish businesses, organizations, and communities that reflected the values and practices they had learned from their experience with transparent management. Josiah Blackwell's transparency dreams had shown him that business success and human welfare weren't competing priorities but complementary aspects of a sustainable economic system. His vision of transparent commerce proved that when people can see the true costs and benefits of economic decisions, they naturally choose approaches that benefit everyone rather than just the people with the most power and wealth. During the height of the French Revolution's reign of terror in 1793, when the guillotine was working overtime and the streets of Paris were literally running red with blood from the constant executions, a Carmelite nun named Sister Marie Claire was hiding in the basement of a safe house in the Marais district, along with 12 other religious sisters whose lives were in constant, immediate danger from the revolutionary authorities who were systematically hunting down and executing anyone associated with the Catholic Church, the aristocracy, or the old regime. Marie Claire was 26 years old, had been in religious life since she was 16, and had never experienced anything more mystical than the occasional moment of deep prayer during Mass or the peaceful contemplation that came from hours of silent meditation in the convent chapel. She wasn't one of those dramatic mystics who claimed to have visions of saints or conversations with angels. Marie Claire was practical, level-headed, the kind of nun who managed the convent's financial records, organized charitable distributions to the poor, and could be counted on to keep her head during crises. But as the executions mounted and the terror intensified throughout 1793, as the revolutionary tribunals became increasingly paranoid and bloodthirsty, condemning people to death for the slightest association with religious or aristocratic institutions, Marie Claire began having transparency dreams that were unlike anything documented in religious literature or mystical traditions. In these dreams, Marie Claire could see through the walls and buildings of Paris itself, observing the hidden locations where other clergy, aristocrats, and political refugees were hiding from the revolutionary authorities who were conducting systematic searches, raids, and arrests throughout the city. Her transparency visions penetrated stone walls, wooden floors, and locked doors, revealing secret hiding places, concealed passages, and underground chambers where people were, desperately trying to survive until the political climate might become less murderous. What made Marie Claire's dreams absolutely extraordinary, and what convinced the resistance networks to take her visions seriously despite their initial skepticism about basing life-and-death decisions on a nun's dreams, was their incredible accuracy and specificity. Marie Claire would dream about seeing specific individuals hiding in particular locations with details so precise that they could be verified and acted upon immediately. She would dream about a priest concealed in the wine cellar of a bakery on Rue Saint-Denis, crouched behind barrels of flour and supplies, and when resistance organizers investigated, they would find exactly that priest in exactly that location, often wearing the exact clothes Marie Claire had described and displaying the same physical condition, exhausted, frightened, but alive. Marie Claire would dream about a noble family hiding in the attic of a blacksmith's shop near Notre Dame, and she could see not just their location but their emotional states, their physical health, and their desperate need for medical attention or food supplies. When rescuers reached these families, they would find situations that matched Marie Claire's visions with documentary precision. She would dream about groups of nuns disguised as laundresses hiding in basement rooms near the Seine, and she could observe their psychological conditions, who was on the verge of breakdown, who was maintaining hope and courage, and who was planning to attempt dangerous escapes that would likely result in capture and execution. In her transparency visions, Marie Claire could see not just where people were hiding, but also their emotional and physical states in ways that were crucial for planning effective rescue operations. She could observe who was sick and needed medical attention before they could be moved safely, who was psychologically stable enough to endure the stress of a dangerous escape attempt, and who was so traumatized or terrified that they needed to remain hidden until safer opportunities developed. Marie Claire could see infected wounds that needed immediate treatment, pregnant women who couldn't undertake strenuous travel, elderly people whose health was too fragile for risky escape attempts, and children who were too young to understand the need for absolute silence during rescue operations. But here's what made Marie Claire's story absolutely remarkable and strategically revolutionary. She could also see the hidden motivations and secret sympathies of the people who were supposed to be hunting the refugees. In her transparency dreams, certain revolutionary guards, police officials, and tribunal members appeared with halos of light around their hearts, indicating that they were secret sympathizers who might be willing to help rather than harm. Religious refugees and political fugitives. Marie Claire could see through the revolutionary rhetoric and political posturing to observe the genuine human compassion that some officials still maintained, despite the pressure to participate in the systematic persecution. She could identify guards who were only following orders out of fear for their own safety, officials who were secretly helping people escape while maintaining their public positions, and bureaucrats who were deliberately processing paperwork slowly to give targets time to flee. This ability to see through the political masks that people wore for survival was incredibly valuable for resistance operations. because it allowed rescuers to identify potential allies and avoid genuine enemies with much greater precision than conventional intelligence gathering could provide. Marie Claire started sharing her visions with the network of people who were organizing clandestine operations to help hide clergy and aristocrats from the revolutionary authorities. At first, the resistance organizers were understandably skeptical about basing rescue operations on a nun's dreams, especially when discovery meant not just failure but torture and execution for everyone involved in the operations. But when Marie Claire's first few visions proved completely accurate, she correctly identified the location of a hidden priest, predicted which guards could be trusted to look the other way during an escape attempt, and anticipated which safe houses had been compromised by informants. People began taking her transparency dreams very seriously as a source of actionable intelligence. Sometimes the most dangerous times require the most impossible tools, and revolutionary terror can only be fought with revolutionary vision. When human institutions fail, perhaps divine providence works through the most unlikely channels. Over the course of 6 months during the height of the terror, Marie Claire's transparency dreams guided one of the most successful rescue operations of the entire French Revolution. Based on her visions, resistance networks successfully evacuated 147 people from Paris: clergy, aristocrats, political moderates, and their families, all of whom would almost certainly have been executed if they had been discovered by the revolutionary tribunals that were condemning dozens of people to death every day. The scale and success of this rescue operation was unprecedented during the terror, when most attempts to help targeted individuals resulted in capture and execution for both the refugees and their would-be rescuers. The fact that Marie Claire's guidance led to such consistently successful outcomes convinced even skeptical resistance leaders that her transparency dreams were providing access to information that couldn't be obtained through conventional means. Marie Claire's transparency dreams were incredibly detailed and practical in ways that made them operationally useful rather than just spiritually inspiring. She could see which escape routes were being watched by authorities, which safe houses had been compromised by informants or surveillance, and which times of day offered the best opportunities for moving people through the city undetected. She could observe patrol patterns of Revolutionary Guards, identify which checkpoints were being staffed by sympathetic officials versus those that were manned by genuine enthusiasts for the revolutionary cause, and predict when political conditions might become more or less dangerous for specific types of refugees. Marie Claire could even see which revolutionary officials could be bribed, and which ones were ideologically committed to finding and executing refugees regardless of financial incentives. This information was crucial for resistance operations that often depended on corrupting officials or appealing to their remaining human compassion. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Marie Claire's transparency visions was her ability to see the psychological states of both the hunters and the hunted with equal clarity and precision. She could observe which refugees were psychologically strong enough to attempt dangerous escapes and which ones needed to remain hidden until safer opportunities developed. Marie Claire could see the specific fears, hopes, and emotional resources that different people possessed, allowing rescue organizers to match escape plans with individual psychological capabilities. She could identify who would remain calm under pressure, who might panic and endanger entire operations, and who possessed the physical and mental stamina required for difficult journeys to safety. Equally important, Marie Claire could see which Revolutionary Guards and officials were beginning to question the justice and necessity of the executions, and which ones might be susceptible to appeals for mercy, bribery, or moral arguments about the value of human life. She could observe the psychological toll that participating in systematic persecution was taking on officials who had started the revolution with genuine idealistic motivations, but were becoming horrified by the bloodshed and paranoia that characterized the terror. Marie Claire could see guilt, doubt, and secret sympathy growing in people who publicly maintained revolutionary orthodoxy but privately questioned whether they were creating justice or just replacing one form of tyranny with another. This psychological intelligence was incredibly valuable for resistance operations because it allowed rescuers to approach potentially sympathetic officials with appropriate arguments and incentives. Someone who was motivated by fear for their own safety required different persuasion than someone who was genuinely conflicted about moral issues. And Marie Claire's transparency dreams provided the insights necessary for these crucial distinctions. Marie Claire's transparency dreams affected her personally in ways that were both inspiring and psychologically devastating. On one hand, she felt called by divine providence to use her visions to save as many lives as possible, and the success of the rescue operations convinced her that she was participating in genuine, miraculous intervention during one of the darkest periods in French history. The knowledge that her dreams were directly saving people's lives gave Marie Claire a sense of purpose and spiritual fulfillment that sustained her through months of danger, uncertainty, and constant fear of discovery. She felt like she was witnessing and participating in divine mercy operating through impossible circumstances. And this experience deepened her faith in ways that conventional religious practices had never achieved. On the other hand, the constant awareness of danger and suffering throughout Paris was emotionally overwhelming for Marie Claire. Her transparency dreams meant that she was psychologically present at every hiding place, every capture, every execution, and every moment of terror that refugees experienced throughout the city. Marie Claire wrote in her spiritual journal about the terrible burden of seeing too much, and described feeling like she was carrying the fears and hopes of an entire city inside my own transparent heart. The responsibility of guiding life and death decisions based on her dreams created enormous psychological pressure that was compounded by the knowledge that any mistake in interpretation could result in capture, torture, and execution for innocent people. The constant exposure to human suffering and terror through her transparency dreams also challenged Marie Claire's understanding of divine providence and the problem of evil. If God was giving her visions to help save people, why was God allowing the systematic persecution and murder of innocent people in the first place? Why was divine intervention limited to helping relatively small numbers of refugees escape rather than ending the terror entirely? These theological questions created spiritual conflicts that Marie Claire struggled with throughout her time in hiding. Her transparency dreams had convinced her that divine providence was actively working to save lives, but they had also shown her the extent of human cruelty and the limitations of miraculous intervention in ways that challenged simplistic understanding of God's relationship to historical events. But perhaps the most touching and psychologically sustaining aspect of Marie Claire's transparency dreams was how they helped her maintain hope and faith in human goodness during one of the most brutal periods in European history. Even when the revolution seemed to be consuming everything decent and holy in French society, Marie Claire could see the hidden compassion that persisted in people's hearts despite the public pressure to participate in persecution and violence. Her dreams showed her revolutionary guards who were secretly merciful, citizens who were quietly helping their persecuted neighbors, despite the personal risks, and resistance networks that were working courageously to protect innocent lives. Marie Claire could see that even during the terror, most people retained their basic human decency and were only participating in persecution because they were frightened, coerced, or manipulated by political extremists. This insight into the hidden goodness that survived even during revolutionary violence gave Marie Claire hope that French society could eventually heal and rebuild on foundations of justice and mercy rather than fear and revenge. Her transparency dreams had shown her that human nature wasn't fundamentally evil, but that ordinary people could be led into terrible actions by political circumstances that appealed to their fears and resentments. Marie Claire's transparency visions also revealed the psychological mechanisms through which revolutionary ideology had convinced otherwise decent people to participate in systematic murder. She could see how fear, propaganda, group pressure, and the gradual normalization of violence had corrupted people's moral judgment and made them capable of actions that would have horrified them under normal circumstances. This understanding made Marie Claire more compassionate toward people who were participating in the persecution, even while she worked to save their victims. She could see that many officials and guards were trapped by political circumstances rather than motivated by genuine cruelty, and that they might be redeemed if political conditions changed. And they were given opportunities to act according to their better instincts. Marie Claire survived the revolution and lived until 1847, eventually becoming the abbess of a reformed Carmelite convent that she established in the countryside outside Paris. She never again experienced transparency dreams on the scale of her revolutionary visions, but she credited those experiences with teaching her profound lessons about divine providence, human nature, and the relationship between individual conscience and political circumstances. In her later writings, Marie Claire reflected on the spiritual significance of her transparency dreams. Divine providence often works through human transparency, moments when people become clear enough to see and serve the hidden needs around them. But this transparency isn't just about seeing through walls or reading minds. It's about seeing through the fear, hatred, and confusion that prevent people from acting according to their deepest values. During the Terror, I learned that the greatest miracles aren't supernatural interventions that override human freedom, but moments when people become transparent enough to recognize their connections to each other and choose compassion over cruelty, mercy over revenge, and love over fear. The rescue network that used Marie Claire's visions as guidance became a model for resistance operations throughout the revolutionary period and influenced later humanitarian efforts during times of political persecution. Several historians have noted that the success rate of Marie Claire's guided rescues was dramatically higher than other operations that relied purely on conventional intelligence and planning. The techniques developed by Marie Claire's resistance network, using spiritual insight to identify both practical opportunities and psychological readiness, combining mystical guidance with careful operational planning, and appealing to the hidden compassion that survives even during times of systematic persecution, influenced later humanitarian organizations and contributed to the development of more effective approaches to protecting civilian populations during political conflicts. Sister Marie Claire's transparency dreams had shown her that even during the darkest periods of human history, divine mercy continues working through people who become transparent enough to see beyond immediate circumstances and serve needs that are hidden from conventional perception. Her revolutionary visions proved that spiritual insight and practical action could combine to create genuine miracles of human compassion and survival. During the devastating Black Death outbreak that struck Florence in 1348, killing somewhere between 30 and 60% of the city's population and creating scenes of horror that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe in language that could convey the sheer scale of suffering and social collapse. A physician named Dr. Lorenzo Medici, no relation to the famous banking family that wouldn't rise to prominence for another century, began having transparency dreams that essentially allowed him to see how the plague was spreading through human bodies and communities in ways that wouldn't be understood by medical science until the development of germ theory in the 19th century. Lorenzo was already one of the most respected physicians in Florence, a city that was considered one of the most medically advanced in medieval Europe, with hospitals, medical schools, and practitioners who were trained in the best available knowledge from Greek, Roman, and Islamic medical traditions. Lorenzo was known for his careful observation of symptoms, his systematic approach to diagnosis, and his relatively successful treatment methods during an era when most medical practice was still based on ancient texts, astrological calculations, and superstitions rather than actual understanding of disease processes. But when the plague hit Florence in the spring of 1348, arriving through trade routes that connected the city to Mediterranean ports where ships were bringing not just silk and spices, but also the deadliest pandemic in human history, Lorenzo found himself treating dozens of patients daily, watching helplessly as most of them died despite his best efforts to apply everything he had learned during decades of medical practice. The Black Death was unlike anything European physicians had ever encountered, a disease so virulent and lethal that it killed people within days or even hours of the first symptoms, creating enormous swollen buboes in the lymph nodes, causing high fevers and delirium, and spreading so rapidly through communities that entire Neighborhoods would be empty within weeks of the first cases appearing. Lorenzo worked tirelessly to understand the disease and develop effective treatments, but conventional medieval medicine was completely inadequate for dealing with a pandemic of this magnitude and virulence. Bloodletting, the most common treatment for most illnesses, seemed to make plague patients worse. Herbal remedies that were effective for other conditions had no impact on plague symptoms. Astrological calculations and religious rituals, which were considered essential components of medical practice, provided no guidance for dealing with this unprecedented catastrophe. As the death toll mounted and Lorenzo watched patient after patient die regardless of his treatment efforts, he began experiencing profound psychological stress and spiritual crisis that manifested as increasingly vivid and disturbing dreams. But these weren't typical anxiety dreams or religious visions. Lorenzo started having transparency dreams that revealed the plague's mechanisms with startling accuracy and scientific precision. In his dreams, Lorenzo could see inside infected patients' transparent bodies and observe what he described as tiny invisible armies, attacking healthy tissue throughout their systems. He could watch these microscopic invaders, which we now know were Yersinia pestis bacteria spreading through blood vessels, concentrating in lymph nodes where they caused their characteristic swelling, and overwhelming the body's natural defenses in ways that matched modern understanding of how bubonic plague actually works. This was 500 years before anyone had seen bacteria under a microscope, 400 years before the development of scientific method as we understand it, and 300 years before physicians began to understand that infectious diseases were caused by microorganisms rather than bad air, astrological influences, or divine punishment. Yet Lorenzo's dream descriptions of plague progression matched contemporary medical knowledge of Yersinia pestis infection with remarkable accuracy. In his transparency dreams, Lorenzo could see the plague bacteria multiplying in patients' lymphatic systems, causing the massive swelling that created the painful buboes that were the most obvious symptom of the disease. He could observe the bacteria spreading through the bloodstream, causing the septicemia that led to the rapid death that characterized the most severe cases of plague. Lorenzo could also see how the plague affected different organ systems, the respiratory complications that occurred when bacteria reached the lungs, the neurological effects that caused the delirium and mental confusion that many patients experienced, and the circulatory collapse that led to death in the most advanced cases. But even more remarkably, Lorenzo's transparency dream showed him how the plague was spreading between people and through the environment in ways that anticipated modern epidemiological understanding by centuries. He could see what he called seeds of disease, being carried by fleas jumping between rats and humans, transmitted through respiratory droplets when infected people coughed or breathed heavily, and persisting in contaminated clothing, bedding, and household objects. Lorenzo's dream visions showed him that the plague wasn't spreading through bad air or astrological influences, as most medieval physicians believed, but through specific, observable mechanisms of transmission that could potentially be interrupted through appropriate precautions. He could see fleas carrying plague bacteria from infected rats to human hosts, and he could observe how close contact between infected and healthy people led to new cases of the disease. Based on these transparency visions, Lorenzo developed treatment and prevention methods that were centuries ahead of his time and dramatically more effective than conventional 14th century medical practice. He started isolating patients to prevent transmission, a practice that wouldn't become standard medical protocol until much later. He began advocating for the removal of dead animals, especially rats, from living areas, recognizing their role in plague transmission long before anyone understood the connection between rodents and epidemic disease. Lorenzo recommended that healthy people avoid close contact with infected individuals' clothing and bedding, understanding that contaminated materials could harbor and transmit plague bacteria. He developed disinfection procedures using wine, vinegar, and fire that were surprisingly effective at destroying pathogenic microorganisms, though he didn't understand the scientific reasons why these methods worked. Lorenzo's plague treatments, based on his transparency dreams, were dramatically more successful than conventional medieval medicine. While most physicians were still relying on bloodletting, astrological calculations, and religious rituals to treat plague victims, Lorenzo was essentially practicing evidence-based medicine, guided by his impossible visions of bacterial transmission and infection processes. His survival rates were significantly higher than other physicians. His prevention methods were more effective at limiting transmission within households and communities, and his diagnostic accuracy was superior because he could recognize different stages and types of plague infection based on what he had observed in his transparency dreams. When death is everywhere and conventional medicine has failed completely, sometimes the sleeping mind can see what waking science cannot yet understand: the invisible networks that connect all life and death, and the hidden mechanisms through which disease moves like a river of destruction through human communities. What made Lorenzo's transparency dreams completely unique in medieval medical literature was their focus on connections and systems rather than just individual anatomy and symptoms. Lorenzo could see how the plague was spreading through Florence's social and economic networks, how trade routes, family connections, religious gatherings, and communal activities were facilitating disease transmission in patterns that wouldn't be understood by epidemiologists for centuries. In his dreams, Lorenzo could see the plague moving through the city like a living map, following the pathways of human interaction and environmental connection. He could observe how crowded living conditions accelerated transmission, how certain occupations created higher exposure risks, and how social and religious practices influenced the spread of infection through different communities. Lorenzo started mapping these transmission networks based on his transparency dreams, creating what may have been the first epidemiological charts in European medical history. His maps showed which neighborhoods would be hit hardest by the plague, which trade routes needed to be interrupted to slow transmission, and which social practices were most dangerous during the outbreak. These epidemiological insights allowed Lorenzo to provide remarkably accurate predictions about the plague's progression through Florence and surrounding areas. He could forecast which districts would experience severe outbreaks, estimate timing for peak infection rates in different communities, and identify the most effective intervention points for limiting overall transmission. The city government of Florence initially dismissed Lorenzo's recommendations as the desperate theories of a physician driven mad by watching too many patients die. Medieval authorities were accustomed to dealing with disease through prayer, religious processions, and moral reforms rather than systematic public health measures based on understanding of transmission mechanisms. But when Lorenzo's predictions about plague progression proved consistently accurate, and when his treatment and prevention methods showed dramatically better results than conventional medical approaches, civic authorities began implementing his suggestions despite their skepticism about the theoretical foundation for his recommendations. Lorenzo's transparency-based plague response helped save hundreds of lives in Florence and influenced public health measures throughout northern Italy and eventually other parts of Europe. His emphasis on isolation, sanitation, and interrupting transmission networks became the foundation for more effective plague management strategies that helped end outbreaks more quickly than they might have otherwise lasted. The psychological impact of Lorenzo's transparency dreams was profound and lasting. After seeing disease and death operating according to invisible but systematic principles, he developed a much more scientific and less superstitious approach to medicine that influenced his practice for the rest of his career and his teaching of younger physicians. Lorenzo began viewing illness as a natural process that could be understood and influenced through careful observation and logical intervention rather than as a mysterious punishment, divine test, or inevitable fate. This scientific perspective was revolutionary in 14th century medical culture and contributed to the gradual development of more empirical approaches to medical practice during the early Renaissance. But Lorenzo's transparency dreams also filled him with a profound sense of overwhelming responsibility and moral burden. He felt like he had been given access to life-saving knowledge that he was obligated to use for the benefit of his community, even when sharing his insights made him appear eccentric, heretical, or potentially mad to other physicians and authorities. The weight of knowing that his transparency visions could prevent deaths made Lorenzo feel personally responsible for every plague victim he couldn't save, every outbreak he couldn't prevent, and every community that suffered because they didn't have access to the knowledge he had gained through his dreams. This psychological pressure was compounded by the constant exposure to death and suffering that characterized medical practice during the Black Death. Lorenzo documented his transparency dreams and plague observations in a comprehensive medical treatise called Visiones Pestilentia, Visions of Pestilence, that he hoped would help future physicians understand and combat epidemic diseases more effectively. His writings combined detailed descriptions of his dream visions with practical recommendations for treatment and prevention that were based on his observations of plague transmission and progression. Visiones Pestilentia was one of the most advanced medical texts of the medieval period, containing insights about infectious disease that were centuries ahead of contemporary medical knowledge. The treatise described bacterial infection processes, transmission mechanisms, and public health interventions that wouldn't be officially recognized by European medicine until the development of modern microbiology and epidemiology. Lorenzo's medical writings were rediscovered during the 18th century by physicians who were developing early theories of infectious disease transmission. Medical historians were amazed by the accuracy of Lorenzo's insights about plague mechanisms and the effectiveness of his prevention methods, especially considering that he was working without access to microscopes, laboratory techniques, or scientific theories that could explain the phenomena he was observing. Several prominent 18th and 19th century physicians credited Lorenzo's transparency, dream-based approach to plague treatment with anticipating major discoveries in medical science and influencing the development of more effective approaches to epidemic disease management. Lorenzo survived the Black Death and lived until 1385, spending his later years developing medical education programs that emphasized careful observation, systematic thinking, and evidence-based treatment rather than blind adherence to ancient authorities or superstitious practices. His transparency, dream-based approach to medicine helped establish Florence as a center of medical innovation during the early Renaissance. Many historians credit Lorenzo's plague work with helping to lay the foundation for the scientific revolution that would transform European medicine several centuries later. His emphasis on observation, hypothesis testing, and systematic analysis of disease patterns represented a fundamental shift away from medieval medical practice toward approaches that would eventually become standard scientific method. But perhaps most importantly, Lorenzo's transparency dreams had shown him that effective medicine required understanding the connections between individual health and community welfare, between personal treatment and public health measures, and between scientific knowledge and moral responsibility. His plague visions had revealed that physicians couldn't just treat individual patients. They needed to understand and address the social, economic, and environmental factors that influence disease transmission throughout entire communities. This holistic understanding of medicine as both individual treatment and social intervention influenced Renaissance medical education and helped establish traditions of public health practice that recognized physicians' responsibilities for community welfare as well as individual patient care. Dr. Lorenzo Medici's transparency dreams had given him unprecedented insight into the mechanisms of epidemic disease, but they had also taught him that medical knowledge was meaningless unless it was used to serve human communities with compassion, wisdom, and an understanding that individual health and collective welfare were inseparably connected through invisible networks of relationship and responsibility. In 11th century Baghdad, during the absolute height of the Islamic Golden Age, when the city was arguably the most sophisticated metropolis in the world, a place where scholars from 3 continents came to study mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, where the House of Wisdom contained the largest collection of books on earth, and where merchants traded everything from Chinese silk to African gold, there was a spice merchant named Abdul Rahman who had developed an unusual and somewhat uncomfortable reputation for being able to detect dishonesty in business dealings with what seemed like supernatural accuracy. Other merchants in Baghdad's famous spice markets would joke that Abdul Rahman could see through lies like morning sun through silk, But they had absolutely no idea how literally true that statement actually was, or how much psychological torment this ability caused Abdul Rahman on a daily basis as he navigated the complex world of medieval Middle Eastern commerce. Abdul Rahman had been having transparency dreams since childhood, growing up in a merchant family that had traded spices along the Silk Road for 3 generations. But unlike the dramatic religious visions that some Islamic mystics reported, or the medical revelations that occasionally appeared in scholarly texts, Abdul Rahman's transparency dreams were focused on the hidden emotional and moral landscape of human relationships, especially the complex dynamics of trust, deception, and mutual benefit that governed commercial transactions. In his dreams, people appeared transparent not just physically, but emotionally and morally. Abdul Rahman could see greed manifesting as dark, swirling clouds around people's hearts that obscured their ability to make fair decisions. He could observe dishonesty as tangled webs of deception that literally filled people's heads like parasitic networks, making it impossible for them to think clearly or maintain consistent relationships. Conversely, Abdul Rahman could watch genuine kindness glow like internal light that seemed to emanate from people's entire bodies, creating an atmosphere of warmth and trustworthiness that made business negotiations more pleasant and productive for everyone involved. He could see integrity as a kind of structural stability that made people's transparent bodies appear solid and reliable, while moral confusion or ethical compromise made people appear fragmented and unstable. When Abdul Rahman reached adulthood and formally entered the spice trade, inheriting his family's established relationships with suppliers from India, Ceylon, and the Indonesian islands, his transparency dreams gave him an enormous advantage in a business environment where trust and reputation were literally everything, and where a single bad decision about which suppliers to work with or which customers to extend credit to could destroy a merchant family's prosperity for generations. Abdul Rahman could tell which suppliers were trying to pass off inferior cinnamon as premium quality, which customers were planning to pay with counterfeit diners, and which business partners were secretly working with competitors to manipulate prices or steal trade secrets. His transparency dreams revealed the hidden motivations and true character of everyone he dealt with, allowing him to avoid partnerships that would have been disastrous and identify opportunities that other merchants missed. But what made Abdul Rahman's story absolutely fascinating from a moral and business perspective was how he chose to use his transparency visions. Instead of simply avoiding dishonest people or using his insights to gain unfair advantages over competitors, Abdul Rahman developed what he called redemptive commerce business practices, designed to create opportunities for people to choose honesty over deception, even when they were initially inclined toward dishonest behavior. If his dreams showed him that a supplier was desperate and considering adulterating his spices with cheaper materials to increase profit margins, Abdul Rahman wouldn't simply find a different supplier. Instead, he would offer better payment terms, advance credit that removed the financial pressure motivating the temptation to cheat, or propose partnership arrangements that made honest dealing more profitable than deception. When Abdul Rahman's transparency dreams revealed that a customer was struggling financially, but trying to maintain appearances by purchasing expensive spices he couldn't actually afford, Abdul Rahman would discreetly arrange payment plans, barter arrangements, or alternative products that preserved the customer's dignity while ensuring that both parties benefited from the transaction. This approach required enormous emotional intelligence and business creativity, because Abdul Rahman had to address people's underlying problems and motivations without revealing that he possessed impossible knowledge about their private circumstances and hidden intentions. He became a master at asking questions and making suggestions that seemed natural but were actually designed to help people make better choices and build more sustainable business relationships. True transparency isn't about exposing people's weaknesses to gain advantage over them. It's about seeing their potential for goodness and creating conditions where that goodness can flourish naturally, benefiting everyone involved. The results of Abdul Rahman's redemptive commerce approach were remarkable and eventually transformed the entire culture of Baghdad's spice markets. Suppliers who worked with Abdul Rahman often found themselves becoming more ethical in their other business, Relationships because they had experienced what it felt like to be trusted and supported rather than suspected and monitored. Customers who had been treated with understanding and flexibility by Abdul Rahman became more honest and reliable in their dealings with other merchants, because they had learned that business relationships based on mutual respect and genuine concern were more satisfying and ultimately more profitable than transactions based purely on immediate advantage. Abdul Rahman's reputation for fairness and wisdom spread throughout the Islamic commercial world, attracting business partners from as far away as Andalusia and Central Asia who wanted to work with someone they could trust completely. His approach to combining transparency insights with compassionate business practices became a model for Islamic commercial ethics that influenced trade relationships throughout the medieval Middle East. But Abdul Rahman's transparency dreams also created personal challenges that were both spiritually and psychologically complex. The constant awareness of other people's hidden motivations and moral struggles made it difficult for him to form genuine friendships or romantic relationships, because he was never sure whether people's affection for him was authentic or influenced by his business success and reputation for generosity. Abdul Rahman also struggled with questions about divine providence and human responsibility. If Allah had given him the ability to see people's hidden moral states, was he obligated to help everyone he encountered? Or should he focus his efforts on people who seemed most capable of genuine change? Did his transparency dreams represent a blessing that he should use to serve his community, or a test of his own moral character and spiritual development? These theological questions became particularly complex when Abdul Rahman's dreams revealed moral problems in people who were too powerful or dangerous to approach directly. When he saw corruption in government officials or religious authorities, Abdul Rahman had to decide whether to remain silent to protect himself and his family, or to find ways to address problems that could have serious political and social consequences. Abdul Rahman eventually developed a sophisticated approach to using his transparency insights that balanced practical wisdom with moral responsibility. He focused his redemptive commerce efforts on situations where he could make a genuine difference without creating unnecessary risks. And he used his business success to support broader social and charitable activities that address systemic problems he couldn't solve through individual interventions. Abdul Rahman lived until 1043, dying peacefully at age 67, surrounded by business partners, former customers, and community members who credited him with demonstrating that commercial success and moral integrity were not just compatible but mutually reinforcing. His approach to transparency-based business ethics influenced Islamic commercial culture throughout the medieval period and helped establish Baghdad's reputation as a center of ethical trade and scholarship. At the very beginning of the Tokugawa period in Japan, when the country was transitioning from centuries of civil war to an era of unprecedented peace and stability, there was a young samurai named Takeshi Hayabusa, who served as a bodyguard for a minor daimyo named Lord Matsudra in rural Kyushu. This was a time of enormous social and political upheaval, when traditional samurai values were being challenged by new realities of centralized government and bureaucratic administration rather than constant warfare. Takeshi was skilled with both katana and wakizashi, devoted to the demanding code of Bushido, and had earned respect among his fellow samurai for his unwavering loyalty and exceptional combat abilities. But beneath his disciplined exterior, Takeshi was troubled by recurring transparency dreams that seemed to conflict with fundamental samurai values of unquestioning loyalty and absolute obedience to one's lord, regardless of personal feelings or moral concerns. In his dreams, Takeshi could see through the people he was supposed to protect, observing their true motivations, hidden character flaws, and secret intentions with clarity that was both enlightening and deeply disturbing. What he saw often contradicted everything he had been taught about honor, loyalty, and the natural order of social hierarchy that was supposed to govern samurai society. The transparency dreams revealed corruption, cruelty, and political schemes that seemed to violate the ethical principles that were supposed to guide samurai conduct. Lord Matsudra, who appeared noble and honorable in public ceremonies and formal interactions, was revealed in Takeshi's dreams as petty, vindictive, and capable of stunning cruelty towards servants, peasants, and anyone who couldn't defend themselves against his power. In one particularly disturbing dream, Takeshi saw his lord planning to assassinate a rival daimyo through treachery rather than honorable combat. The plan involved poisoning the rival during a tea ceremony that was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting to resolve territorial disputes peacefully. This violated every principle of Bushido that Takeshi had been taught to value above his own life. The transparency dreams created a profound moral crisis for Takeshi that challenged everything he understood about duty, honor, and the samurai code. His training had taught him to serve his lord without question, to follow orders regardless of personal feelings, and to value loyalty above all other considerations, including his own moral judgments about right and wrong. But his visions showed him that blind loyalty might sometimes serve evil purposes, that unthinking obedience could make him complicit in actions that violated the very principles Bushido was supposed to uphold. When his dreams revealed specific plans for dishonorable conduct, Takeshi faced an impossible choice between duty to his lord and loyalty to his own conscience and moral understanding. This internal conflict was particularly agonizing because samurai culture provided no framework for resolving conflicts. Between personal ethics and feudal obligations, the entire social system depended on absolute hierarchical obedience, and questioning a lord's decisions or motivations was considered not just insubordination but a fundamental violation of the natural order that maintained social stability. Takeshi spent weeks in meditation and prayer, trying to understand what his transparency dreams meant and how he should respond to the moral conflicts they revealed. He consulted classical texts about Bushido, seeking guidance from ancient warriors who had faced similar dilemmas, but most traditional sources emphasized duty and obedience rather than individual moral judgment. Sometimes the clearest vision reveals the murkiest moral terrain, and seeing through others forces us to examine what we're willing to see through ourselves. Eventually, Takeshi developed what he called transparent loyalty, a revolutionary approach to samurai service that was based on complete honesty about motivations and consequences rather than unthinking obedience to authority. Instead of simply following orders without question, Takeshi began counseling his daimyo about the long-term costs and ethical implications of proposed actions. When Lord Matsuda discussed plans that Takeshi's transparency dreams had revealed would be dishonorable or ultimately harmful, Takeshi would respectfully but firmly present alternative approaches that would achieve the Lord's legitimate objectives through more ethical means. He used insights from his dreams to show how certain policies would damage the domain's reputation, create dangerous enemies, or undermine the social stability that effective governance required. This approach was absolutely revolutionary in early 17th century Japanese society, where a direct contradiction of a superior's wishes could result in forced suicide or execution. But Takeshi presented his counsel with such obvious genuine concern for his lord's welfare and success that even Lord Matsuda recognized the wisdom and loyalty behind what might otherwise have seemed like dangerous insubordination. Takeshi's transparent loyalty proved remarkably effective in preventing the political disasters he had foreseen in his dreams. When Lord Matsuda was planning the assassination of his rival through poisoned tea, Takeshi convinced him that such treachery would create powerful enemies who would eventually seek revenge, potentially destroying the entire domain. Instead, Takeshi proposed a diplomatic solution that addressed the underlying territorial disputes while preserving both Lord's honor and safety. The success of this approach gradually transformed the relationship between Takeshi and his daimyo from one of simple, hierarchical obedience to genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to effective, ethical governance. Lord Matsuda began consulting Takeshi not just about security matters but about broader questions of domain administration and political strategy. Other samurai in Lord Matsuda's service initially viewed Takeshi's approach with suspicion and concern, worried that his willingness to challenge their lord's decisions would undermine the entire foundation of samurai loyalty and social order. But when they observed that Takeshi's counsel consistently led to better outcomes, and that his transparent honesty actually strengthened rather than weakened his relationship with their lord. Some began adopting similar approaches to their own service. The concept of transparent loyalty gradually spread throughout Lord Matsudra's domain and eventually influenced other samurai-lord relationships in Kyushu and beyond. Instead of the traditional model of blind obedience that often led to disasters when lords made poor decisions, this new approach emphasized honest communication, ethical reflection, and mutual accountability between samurai and their superiors. Takeshi's transparency dreams had shown him that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to challenge authority when that authority was leading toward harmful or dishonorable outcomes. His willingness to risk punishment or death by speaking honestly to his lord ultimately prevented numerous conflicts, saved lives, and helped establish more stable and effective governance in their domain. But the personal cost of this approach was significant for Takeshi. Living with constant awareness of other people's hidden motivations and moral failings created psychological burdens that were difficult to bear. He could never interact with authority figures without being conscious of the gap between their public personas and their private intentions, and this knowledge sometimes made normal social relationships almost impossible to maintain. Takeshi also struggled with questions about the appropriate limits of his transparent loyalty. If his dreams revealed that his lord was planning something genuinely evil, should he go beyond counsel and take active steps to prevent it? If other samurai were planning treachery that would harm innocent people, was he obligated to expose them even if doing so would violate traditional codes of loyalty and discretion? These ethical dilemmas became even more complex as Takeshi's reputation for wisdom and integrity spread beyond his immediate domain. Other daimyo began seeking his counsel, and sometimes his transparency dreams revealed conflicts and contradictions between the interests of different lords he was supposed to serve or respect. Takeshi eventually developed a sophisticated framework for navigating these moral complexities, based on the principle that true Bushido required serving the highest ideals of samurai culture rather than just the immediate wishes of particular individuals. He argued that genuine loyalty sometimes required protecting lords from their own worst impulses and helping them live up to the ethical standards that justified their authority and social position. The most remarkable aspect of Takeshi's story is how his individual moral struggle influenced broader changes in Japanese political culture during the early Tokugawa period. The transition from constant warfare to peaceful governance required new models of leadership and loyalty that emphasized long-term stability and ethical conduct rather than just military prowess and unquestioning obedience. Takeshi's concept of transparent loyalty provided a practical framework for adapting traditional samurai values to the requirements of effective civilian administration. His approach helped establish precedents for honest counsel, ethical reflection, and mutual accountability that influenced Japanese governance throughout the Tokugawa era. When Takeshi died in 1654 at the age of 73, his funeral was attended by samurai from throughout Kyushu who credited him with teaching them that true loyalty required moral courage as well as physical bravery. His approach to combining transparency insights with practical wisdom became a model for samurai-lord relationships that valued honest communication and ethical reflection. The domain that Takeshi served became known throughout Japan for its effective governance, social stability, and ethical leadership, demonstrating that transparency-based loyalty could produce better practical results than traditional models of blind obedience. Takeshi's legacy influenced samurai education and political philosophy for generations, helping to establish more sophisticated and morally grounded approaches to leadership and service. In the narrow, cobblestone streets of Amsterdam during the devastating plague outbreak of 1665, there lived a physician named Dr. Cornelis van der Berk who had dedicated his entire career to understanding disease and healing. Unlike many doctors of his era who relied primarily on bloodletting and herbal remedies, Cornelis was fascinated by the emerging scientific methods that were beginning to revolutionize medicine throughout Europe. Dr. van der Berk wore the iconic plague doctor costume, the long black coat, wide-brimmed hat, and the distinctive bird-like mask with its curved beak. filled with aromatic herbs believed to purify the air and protect against miasmic vapors that were thought to carry disease. But beyond the protective costume, Cornelis possessed something far more unusual, transparency dreams, that allowed him to see through human bodies and observe the progression of disease with startling clarity. These dreams began shortly after Cornelis started treating plague victims in Amsterdam's overcrowded hospitals and makeshift medical facilities. Initially, he dismissed the visions as stress-induced hallucinations brought on by the psychological trauma of witnessing so much death and suffering. But as the dreams became more frequent and more detailed, Cornelis began to realize that his nocturnal visions were providing him with medical insights that seemed impossible according to the anatomical knowledge of his time. In his transparency dreams, Cornelis could observe the human circulatory system, respiratory system, and internal organs functioning in real time. He watched how the plague bacterium, though he had no concept of bacteria in 1665, spread through different parts of the body, causing the characteristic symptoms that he observed in his waking medical practice. He could see how the disease affected different patients in different ways, depending on their age, overall health, and individual constitution. But what made Dr. van der Berg's transparency dreams truly remarkable was their accuracy in predicting which patients would survive the plague and which would succumb to the disease. By observing the internal battle between the infection and each patient's immune response, again, concepts that wouldn't be scientifically understood for centuries, Cornelis could determine with surprising accuracy who was likely to recover and who was beyond medical help. When we learn to see beneath the surface of things, we discover that healing requires understanding not just symptoms, but the hidden connections between body, mind, and the invisible forces that shape our health. This predictive ability allowed Cornelis to allocate his limited medical resources more effectively, focusing intensive care on patients who had the best chances of survival while providing comfort care for those who were likely to die regardless of treatment. His success rate in treating plague victims became legendary throughout Amsterdam, and other physicians began seeking his advice about medical cases that seemed hopeless. Cornelis also used his transparency dreams to develop new treatment approaches that were far ahead of their time. He observed how certain herbal remedies affected different organ systems, which dietary changes could support recovery, and which environmental factors either promoted healing or worsened disease progression. His dream-guided medical practices helped establish some of the earliest principles of what would later become evidence-based medicine. The most profound impact of Dr. van der Berg's transparency dreams was their influence on his understanding of the connection between mental and physical health. In his visions, he could observe how fear, despair, and social isolation affected patients' immune responses and recovery rates. He saw how hope, social support, and spiritual faith could literally strengthen the body's ability to fight disease. This insight led Cornelis to develop holistic treatment approaches that addressed not just the physical symptoms of plague, but also the psychological and social factors that influenced healing. He organized support networks for plague survivors, established protocols for maintaining family connections even during quarantine, and developed therapeutic techniques that would later influence the development of psychosomatic medicine. When the plague outbreak finally ended in 1666, Dr. van der Berg had established himself as one of Amsterdam's most innovative and successful physicians. His transparency, dream-guided medical practices continued to influence Dutch medicine for generations, helping to establish the Netherlands as a center of medical innovation and scientific research. The detailed medical journals that Cornelis kept, documenting his dream visions and their correlation with patient outcomes, became important historical documents that provided insights into both 17th century medical practice and the early development of scientific methodology. Modern medical historians have noted that many of van der Berg's observations and treatment approaches anticipated medical discoveries that wouldn't be officially recognized until the 19th and 20th centuries. You know, what's really fascinating about transparency dreams throughout history is how they seem to appear during times of massive social, political, or scientific change, almost like human. Consciousness was trying to adapt to new realities by developing new ways of perceiving truth and understanding complex situations. Throughout history, people have tried to make sense of transparency dreams in completely different ways, depending on their cultural background and the scientific knowledge available to them. In ancient Egypt, they thought dreams like these were direct communication from the gods, who were showing mortals hidden truths that needed to be revealed for the greater good of society. Can you imagine if we still believe that today? Like your therapist telling you that your dream about seeing through your bosses? Motivations means the gods want you to become a management consultant or something? Meanwhile, across the world in ancient China, they had this whole other idea that transparency dreams were actually evidence of advanced spiritual development, signs that a person's consciousness was becoming refined enough to perceive the subtle energy patterns that connected all living things. They believed that people who had these dreams were natural healers and advisors who should be trained to use their abilities for the benefit of their communities. Buddhist and Hindu traditions developed even more sophisticated explanations, suggesting that transparency dreams occurred when individual consciousness temporarily merged with universal awareness, basically accessing a cosmic perspective that exists outside of normal time and space limitations. According to these philosophies, everything is interconnected through invisible energy patterns, and transparency dreams allowed sensitive individuals to perceive these connections directly. Modern science has some interesting thoughts on all this, though honestly, it still feels like we're just scratching the surface of understanding how dreams work and what they might be capable of. Some neuroscientists think that transparency dreams might result from enhanced pattern recognition, the brain's ability to process subtle social and environmental cues that conscious awareness doesn't normally detect. Dr. Julia Mosbridge at Northwestern University has done fascinating research suggesting that our unconscious minds are constantly analyzing vast amounts of information about other people's behavior, emotional states, and motivations. Most of this analysis happens below the threshold of conscious awareness, but sometimes it emerges in dreams as symbolic representations of hidden truths or future possibilities. There's also interesting research on something called mirror neurons, brain cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe others performing the same action. Some researchers speculate that highly developed mirror neuron systems might allow certain individuals to literally feel what others are experiencing, creating the sensation of seeing through someone else's perspective or emotional state. But even these scientific explanations don't fully account for the remarkable accuracy that many transparency dreamers have demonstrated throughout history. The specific details, the precise predictions, the ability to perceive information that couldn't possibly be available through normal sensory channels. It all suggests that human consciousness might be capable of things that our current scientific models don't recognize or understand. What I find most intriguing is how transparency dreams seem to serve specific purposes in different historical contexts. During times of political upheaval, they often revealed hidden motivations and secret schemes that help people navigate dangerous situations. During medical crises, they provided healing insights that were centuries ahead of official medical knowledge. During periods of social transformation, they helped individuals and communities adapt to changing values and new ways of understanding human relationships. It's almost like transparency dreams represent an evolutionary adaptation, a way for human consciousness to access information and insights that become necessary during times of rapid change or crisis, when normal methods of understanding and decision-making aren't sufficient for survival and success. Before we drift off for the night, let me share a few lesser-known transparency dream stories that almost nobody talks about, but that reveal some really fascinating patterns about how these experiences work and what they might mean for understanding human consciousness. In the archives of the Vatican Library, there's a document from 1347 that describes a nun named Sister Catherine who claimed she could see through the souls of people who came to her convent for spiritual guidance. According to the records, she could perceive their hidden sins, secret fears, and unspoken spiritual struggles with such accuracy that word spread throughout medieval Europe about the transparent saint who could see into people's hearts. What's remarkable about Sister Catherine's case is that she used her transparency dreams not to judge or condemn people, but to provide precisely the kind of spiritual counseling and emotional support that each person needed. She seemed to understand that seeing through someone's defenses and pretenses was a responsibility that required tremendous compassion and wisdom. The church initially investigated her as a possible heretic or witch, but eventually concluded that her abilities were genuine gifts from God that should be used for healing and spiritual guidance. Sister Catherine became one of the most sought-after spiritual advisors in medieval Europe, and her approach to using transparency insights for pastoral care influenced Catholic counseling practices for centuries. There's another fascinating case from the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century involving a court advisor named Ahmed al-Rawi, who claimed his transparency dreams allowed him to see through the political schemes and hidden alliances that constantly shifted in the Sultan's court. Ottoman court records show that Olroy's advice about political strategy and diplomatic relations was remarkably accurate, helping to prevent several wars and political disasters that could have destabilized the empire. What's particularly interesting about Olroy's story is how he developed systematic methods for interpreting his transparency dreams and translating the insights into practical political advice. He kept detailed journals describing the symbolic language his dreams used to represent different political concepts, and he developed techniques for distinguishing between dreams that showed current hidden realities versus dreams that revealed future possibilities. Al-Rawi's work essentially created one of the first systematic approaches to using transparency, dreams for political analysis and strategic planning. His methods influenced Ottoman diplomatic practices and contributed to the empire's success in managing complex international relationships during a period of rapid political change in Europe and the Middle East. Sometimes, I wonder if the people who had these transparency dreams ever realized how their experiences would fascinate researchers and storytellers hundreds of years later. There's something kind of beautiful about that, isn't there? That these intensely personal, mysterious experiences could somehow connect us across time and cultures, revealing universal aspects of human consciousness that transcend historical boundaries. The most private experience, our dreams, can somehow become bridges that connect us to people we've never met, in times and places we've never experienced, showing us that the capacity for insight, empathy, and understanding might be far more universal than we usually realize. If you're somehow still awake, which would honestly surprise me, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had dreams where you felt like you could see through things or people in ways that revealed hidden truths, I'd be curious to hear about it in the comments. There's something about transparency dreams that seems to suggest that human consciousness is capable of perceiving connections and patterns that our normal waking awareness usually misses. Maybe we're all more connected than we think, and maybe our dreams sometimes give us glimpses of that deeper reality. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy falling asleep to these strange dream stories from history. We'll be back next Wednesday with another journey through the weird and wonderful world of historical dreams. Sleep tight, and who knows, maybe tonight you'll dream about seeing through the surface of things to discover whatever hidden truths are waiting to be revealed. See you in your dreams.